Hello, 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 and welcome to another episode of Behind the Walls of the World's Psychiatric Hospitals. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup, and today we're picking up the story of Dr. Henry A. Cotton and the New Jersey State Hospital, Trenton. And thank you so much for your extra patience in this episode airing a little bit later than usual. There's so much information about this doctor and this hospital, and I wanted to make sure that I was able to include as much of that information as possible. So, as with the previous episodes, I'm going to be drawing much of my information from the book Madhouse, A Tragic Tale of Megalomania and Modern Medicine by Andrew Scull. So now, come on in, get comfortable as we go behind the walls of the New Jersey State Hospital at Trenton. We left off in 1924, right after Dr. Cotton spoke at the Medico-Psychological Association of Great Britain and Ireland, where he received many accolades for his work. Once again, he was well received in Europe despite many naysayers and critics back home. No doubt he returned to the US with a larger head than when he left. And just in time, too, because in the fall of 1924, the promised investigation into Dr. Cotton's practices began. The investigator? A young doctor named Phyllis Greenacre. That's right, a woman. Dr. Greenacre is going to get her own special spot in an upcoming episode because she is just too cool to overlook. She was a researcher, practitioner, now an investigator, in addition to being a wife and a mom. And the investigation required her to stay 3 days per week at the asylum for a good part of the year. And she didn't get to stay in Dorothea Dix's suite either. She stayed in a room on the ward for the criminally insane. You guys, I work on this type of unit, and I was talking to my coworkers the other day about this story and trying to imagine what it would be like to spend 3 nights per week in a room on my unit. I don't think you could pay me enough to sleep there. Like, nope. The lack of privacy, the ultra-thin mattresses on steel frames, the noise, the germs. Oh, the germs. No, thank you. But Dr. Greenacre did it. And what she found throughout her investigation was alarming. First was her initial impression of Dr. Cotton himself, whom she found peculiar with a notable uneasiness. She even worried about his own mental stability. Although Andrew Scull doesn't mention this explicitly, I wonder if Dr. Greenacre had a journal where she documented her first impressions, because she didn't seem to bring this up with anyone else. And next, she noticed something different about the patients. She couldn't quite put her finger on it at first until it hit her. They didn't have any teeth, and most didn't have dentures either. That's why their speech was slurred and difficult to understand. Perhaps that was why they looked so emaciated and ill, because it was difficult for them to eat. Perhaps that's why they looked so haggard and older than their actual age. Soon she got back to work on her investigation. The hospital had completed some preparatory work before her arrival by gathering information on 100 cases. It was all neatly typed up and bound in blue covers and tied with a ribbon. The statistician in charge of compiling all the information was known as Mrs. Rue. The strange thing about Mrs. Rue was that she was a former patient of Dr. Cotton. It's not clear from Scull's text if Mrs. Rue had undergone any surgeries, but she was noted to be, quote, a manic depressive who exhibited a touching enthusiasm for Cotton's work, had been placed in charge of the statistical work, and proudly displayed the results, end quote. This seems like an obvious conflict of interest to me. As Dr. Greenacre untied the ribbon and began to read the initial reports, something seemed off from the start. The numbers didn't add up. Quote, there were elementary mistakes in the very first tables. As she looked more closely, she found several instances in which multiple admissions of the same patient were counted as though they were new cases each time. In general, the statistics just did not tally, and her suspicions were further aroused when she saw that virtually all the discharges were classified as cures. The whole document was so sloppy and unprofessional that she was appalled. How could the hospital's board possibly accept this sort of thing? Obviously, it was no use to her. She would have to start from scratch, end quote. And that's what she did. She set out to determine for herself how patients were affected in the immediate aftermath of surgery, as well as how patients who had undergone surgeries years earlier fared in the long term. Dr. Greenacre examined the records on various patients to determine their known histories, diagnoses, treatment, and fate. Some who had previously discharged from the hospital were difficult to track down. When Dr. Greenacre asked the hospital's social workers for assistance, she noticed something odd about them, too. They were wearing dentures. Like Mrs. Rue, the social workers were also previous patients of Dr. Cotton. I can imagine at this point that Dr. Greenacre must have wondered if there were any employees at the asylum she could rely on. Once again, she realized she would have to do the work herself. The patient records were a mess, but Dr. Greenacre sifted through them carefully. For some reason, I envisioned this as a movie montage. There are shots of Dr. Greenacre diligently and seriously looking through paperwork while some ominous music plays in the background. Spliced in from time to time is a nervous-looking Dr. Cotton, standing in a doorway while Dr. Greenacre is turned away from him. And then the scene cuts to Adolph Meyer asking Dr. Cotton how it appears the investigation is going. And Dr. Cotton says that he thinks she is being too harsh in some of her evaluations, but that overall, he is confident that her investigation will support his findings. It's around this time that Dr. Cotton appears to be getting delusional himself. On the surface, he appears confident that she will find the same recovery rates that he did, while a deep undercurrent of stress appears to be taking over his mind. Dr. Greenacre, meanwhile, struggled not only with living at the hospital several nights each week, but also struggled with what she was finding in the patient records. Of the 3 groups of patients whose records she had carefully studied, she saved for last the ones who had undergone the most thorough cleansing, as Skull called it. This was a group of 62 patients, of which 17 had died not long after the surgeries due to peritonitis or postoperative shock. Dr. Greenacre suspected this number would actually be higher, as there were patients who died in the months following the surgeries, but whose deaths could not be definitively linked to the surgery. One patient was Stella Norris, whom Skull describes as, quote, a manic depressive woman who had never really recovered from the colectomy performed on her on October 20th, 1921. Post-operatively, she complained of abdominal pain and diarrhea for some weeks, then temporarily rallied before steadily losing weight after her surgical wound reopened. Cotton professed to find her something of a success story, claiming that mentally there is some improvement, she can be made to smile, conversation is less irrelevant. She does not dwell on her condition to such an extent as formerly. Her wound nonetheless continued to granulate and separate, and 3 days before Christmas she died, officially of a combination of pulmonary tuberculosis, myocarditis, and tuberculous peritonitis, end quote. It makes me wonder how Cotton defined success, as in this success story. Her physical effects from the surgery appear to be worse than being unable to smile or having irrelevant conversation or whatever her original psychiatric symptoms were. Even worse is the story of Julia Thompson, who is described as a young woman with recurrent manic depression, what we would call bipolar disorder today. She was admitted to the asylum on September 11th, 1922, where she received a thorough medical exam. 2 days later, her tonsils were removed. 9 days later, she received a total colectomy, after which she ran a fever of 100 to 102 degrees for a month or 6 weeks without cause being discovered. While she still had that high fever, she had 16 teeth removed and was injected with numerous vaccines. And vaccines at this time were more like interventions than preventative measures. She was then deemed to have improved and was discharged to the care of her relatives. 8 months later, Julia's mother died, and she was said to have a relapse of psychiatric symptoms. Or, and hear me out, maybe it was grief? And those symptoms were accompanied by stomach pains and vomiting. Her family said she needed to return to Trenton, but Julia protested adamantly, not wanting to go back to what must have felt like torture. After her readmission, she tried to conceal her pain in order to avoid having another operation. But within hours of getting to the hospital, she was taken to the operating room. She was given a laparotomy and a colostomy. 8 days later, Julia Thompson was dead from postoperative peritonitis. What an absolute nightmare. In this scene of the movie I'm envisioning of this story, I see Dr. Greenacre at a desk reading this particular record. She puts down the papers, takes off her glasses, and rubs her eyes while sighing. It's all too much. It's as if Julia knew what her fate would be if she returned to the hospital. All that following the death of her mother. What if they had just allowed her to grieve without attributing her symptoms to somatic issues? Dr. Greenacre seemed to grow increasingly aware every day that Dr. Cotton's operations weren't doing any good, and she was determined to find out what the long-term effects were, and that they were also not as successful. She set out to find patients who had been operated on and who had returned to the community. She visited the home of Mrs. Anita Ludwig on March 26, 1925, at Mrs. Ludwig's New Jersey farm. She would later write that Mrs. Ludwig, quote, came to the window of the house in response to my knock, and while she talked, she held the curtains around her so that only her face was visible. After a few minutes, however, she relented and invited me in. The house is an old-fashioned farmhouse with large windows. These were crowded with a profusion of half-broken furniture. The two rooms through which we first passed, those most used by the family as living rooms, were exceedingly dirty, and the other two rooms, evidently parlors, were only disordered. Mrs. Ludwig is an enormously obese woman with irregularly bobbed hair which appears unwashed and uncombed. Her face is dirty and there are coffee marks around her lips. Her costume is a striking affair of one piece of rough brown material with a hole cut out for the neck. The frayed edges around the neck are not hemmed, and the whole dress is appallingly dirty. She wears no clothes, and the toes of one foot protrude conspicuously through a hole in one stocking. End quote. From this description, it appears that Dr. Greenacre initially found Mrs. Ludwig to not be recovered. However, what she discovered as the woman continued talking was far worse. Her husband was an alcoholic who physically abused her. Mrs. Ludwig was covered in bruises and scars and other injuries. She suffered headaches from his blows to the head. He would regularly force her to ride in the car with him while he was driving drunk, which scared her every time. She noted that she felt superior to her husband. He could neither read nor write, but while she was fluent in Russian, German, and English. Dr. Greenacre went on to note that Mrs. Ludwig appeared to have indeed recovered from her psychosis, but had been left to another egregious fate. All while Dr. Greenacre was working on her investigation, the operations in Trenton continued as they had before. In fact, in early 1925, a total of 274 individuals from various jails and prisons around New Jersey were found to have suspicions of focal infection and were then sent to the asylum for further investigation and treatment. The mounting pressure from Dr. Greenacre's investigation and criticism from his colleagues in the field must have started to eat away at Dr. Cotton. The Bright Committee continued its investigation at the same time, and he became increasingly nervous and uneasy. Add to that the deaths of two patients, including Julia Thompson, whom we discussed earlier, being publicized by the media, and Dr. Cotton was facing incredible stressors. By the time he was called to testify in the ongoing hearings, Cotton was a nervous wreck. Skull described him as, quote, nervously pacing up and down the hallway, sweating profusely, and growing visibly more agitated as the start of the session grew nearer. He could be observed muttering to himself and glaring angrily towards several of the people gathered on the benches. Finally, he stopped in front of a man he apparently recognized and informed him that if he was there as a potential witness, his services would not be required until a later date, end quote. Now listen, I'm no lawyer, but I don't think you can do that when you're the subject of an investigation. Just say, hey, you can't be here right now? Don't think so. Clearly unhinged, Dr. Cotton began angrily interrupting witnesses on the stand until Senator Bright called for a recess. Dr. Cotton took that moment to slip out of the courtroom and disappear. The sergeant at arms sent out a search party to scour the Capitol, and Dr. Cotton was brought back promptly. Called to testify was a number of former patients and family members of former patients. The children of a woman in her 60s, Leah Bloom, had already testified on behalf of their mother. They had explained that Mrs. Bloom had been in and out of the hospital at least a dozen times since 1895 and was readmitted in December 1924. Immediately after that readmission, She had her teeth and tonsils removed and was discharged 3 months later. The primary issue, they reported, was that neither Mrs. Bloom nor the family had given consent for the procedures. When Mrs. Bloom learned that her family planned to readmit her to the hospital in July 1925, she pleaded with her children, panic-stricken, not to send her back. They operate, do anything to you, she told them. If I'm ever taken back to the state hospital, I'll never get out alive. And I want to offer a trigger warning here for the next part due to physical abuse and violent threats. If you'd like to skip ahead at this part, fast forward about a minute and a half. A few days after Mrs. Bloom returned to the hospital, her children went to visit and found her, quote, lying on a bed in the corner of the room. One eye was closed and dreadfully swollen. I hardly knew her. Her arms were dug out and flies swarmed about her. I pulled down the covers and she was a mass of bruises. The side of her face was in a terrible condition. There were nail marks on her throat as if she had been choked. She looked as though she had been dragged by her hair, end quote. And her other daughter added to this, saying, quote, her arm had been dug out and it looked as though she had proud flesh. There were scratches on her back and breast. There was a big lump on her neck, and she tried to call for my eldest sister and her mother and father. I could hardly distinguish what she said, end quote. And remember, this was mere days after their mother's return to the hospital. Days. Within a week, Leah Bloom was dead from what the hospital first called natural causes and later self-inflicted injuries. Mrs. Bloom's name was once again at the center stage in the hearings, only this time her family was not there. They were at her funeral, which had been scheduled for the same day. In their place, the county physician Charles Mitchell was there to testify. He seemed inconvenienced by this matter and said that he only needed to glance at Mrs. Bloom's body to see that she had died a natural death. When Mrs. Bloom's children demanded that he examine the condition of their mother's stomach, he instead responded angrily with a threat to cut off Mrs. Bloom's head and rip her body open from head to toe if her daughters didn't stop arguing with him about the cause of her death. I'm sorry, what? Really professional, right? Especially to grieving family members. Meanwhile, Dr. Cotton had disappeared once again. The hospital's warden was sent out to find him and found him in the rain without a jacket, dripping wet and seemingly disoriented to time and place. He first didn't respond, but later told the warden that he was searching for his car, apparently forgetting that the warden had driven him down earlier. He was such a sight that the warden knew Dr. Cotton couldn't go back into the courtroom in that condition. He would look insane himself. So he called Dr. Bright and informed him that the doctor had fallen ill and needed to leave urgently. And in fact, Dr. Cotton had gotten sick, ironically with Bright's disease, though it had nothing to do with the Bright Committee, of course, and he would be bedridden for weeks. But the hearings continued, with former patients both singing Dr. Cotton's praises and describing the horrific abuses and frantic protests they witnessed on the way to the operating room. By the fall of 1925, Dr. Greenacre's study was complete, but Cotton's mentor, Dr. Meyer, essentially muzzled her from divulging its contents during the hearing. He pleaded with her not to only say on the stand that she didn't see any cruelty or lack of consent during the procedures, which she hadn't. But Dr. Greenacre was confused. After almost a year of investigating, Dr. Meyer wanted her to not give the results of what she found. And for what? To preserve Cotton's reputation? When she finally did get to the stand, the legislators were somehow under the impression that her findings actually supported Dr. Cotton's work. So they asked her if she had witnessed any cruel treatment of patients or lack of consent. Her answers were brief and non-committal, though accurate, and she was quickly excused from the stand. More former patients testified about what they had witnessed, but of course they were dismissed as exaggerating or misremembering the truth. Comparing insane patients and employees who had been fired to esteemed doctors on the stand seemed to be a futile effort. So when one of the primary members of the hospital's board of directors expressed complete confidence and assurance in Dr. Cotton's methods, he was the one whose testimony carried weight. The investigation began to wind down, and legislators believed that the names of good men at the hospital were being tarnished by people who merely wanted vengeance for perceived wrongs. And so it seemed Dr. Cotton was in the clear yet again. His health was still precarious, and he had been sent out of the state to recover. He came back for a short while to the hospital, but left again for another month to rest. He slowly began to recover as 1925 came to a close, although he wasn't able to return to the hospital just quite yet. By the beginning of 1926, Dr. Cotton had several of his own infected teeth removed in an attempt to improve his health. Say what you will about the guy, but he clearly believed in his methods. On January 14th, 1926, Dr. Cotton was recovered enough to finally meet with Dr. Greenacre and Dr. Meyer to discuss the results of Dr. Greenacre's investigation. He brought his wife along for emotional support. During this meeting, it was Dr. Meyer who seemed uncomfortable. After all, he had been Cotton's mentor and he had been supporting him all these years. Dr. Greenacre began by outlining how she selected cases and set up her story, which is standard operating procedure for any research project. Cotton immediately became defensive and interrupted and challenged her frequently. Dr. Meyer implored him to listen to the facts and reserve judgment. Dr. Greenacre pointed out that she could not find the 85% cure rate he had boasted of for so long. In fact, the number had been far lower, 59.6% at the highest. I can almost see Dr. Cotton blustering in and saying something like, no, your numbers are wrong, see? Because Dr. Greenacre re-examined a particular number and noticed there was indeed a small error. The cure rate was actually 60.1%, a half a percentage point off. Still significantly less than the 85% Cotton had been bragging about for years. In short, Dr. Greenacre's findings went something like this. Of her first set of 100 cases, she found that 60 of them were functional psychotics, meaning people whose mental illness may have been genetically linked, whereas the other 40 were organic cases, where mental illness had been brought on by alcoholism, epilepsy, syphilis, and so on. Dr. Cotton had claimed that functional cases could be cured with surgery, but Dr. Greenacre only found that 7 of the 60 patients, so less than 12%, could actually be called recovered, and only 5 more improved. Most of them, she told him, were either dead or unimproved. Of the 60 functional patients, 16 had died post-surgery and 18 remained at the hospital. The second group of 100 cases was the group selected by the hospital. Of these, 32 were described as recovered and living normal, active lives. It was a higher number, yes, but far from the 85% recovery rate that Dr. Cotton had touted. Ironically, Dr. Greenacre pointed out the largest number of recovered cases were among patients who had undergone minimal or no surgery at all. And the lowest recovery rate was among those who had the most thorough treatment. And what did Cotton think about that? Dr. Cotton left the meeting with Greenacre and Meyer angry, but still with his head in the sand. "You're not going to get me on these statistics," he said angrily as he stormed out of the room. I imagine Dr. Greenacre rolling her eyes at Dr. Meyer before saying something like, "Well, that went just about as well as I expected." Dr. Cotton held a grudge against both Greenacre and Meyer after the January meeting. He ignored his mentor's invites to his home and basically sulked around for a few months before eventually running into Dr. Meyer at a conference in June 1926. They didn't say much to one another, but Dr. Cotton said that he planned to refute Dr. Greenacre's findings. In November 1926, Dr. Cotton showed up at a national conference in Baltimore, armed with new statistics to argue against Dr. Greenacre's investigation. He accused her of omitting 37 cases and insisting that some cases she deemed not recovered were actual success stories. By the end, he said he found up to 92% were in fact recovered. Of those who had a colectomy, 30 died, whatever, but up to 92% recovered. And he was boasting that he had performed 16 surgeries in a row without a single death. Doesn't exactly seem like something to be bragging about. So anyway, at this point, Dr. Cotton seemed absolutely delusional. By January 1927, the Bright Committee had dissolved, so Dr. Cotton no longer had to worry about it. Tensions regarding Dr. Greenacre's investigation were fading, and things were seemingly going back to normal. Dr. Greenacre returned to Trenton in June 1927 to double-check some of her findings and to see if her study required additional updates. Meanwhile, Dr. Cotton had been invited to speak again at a medical conference in Europe. He and his family arrived in Paris on July 3, 1927, where he was unimpressed by Parisian psychiatry. They left for London on July 10th, where they stayed for 3 weeks. Once again, Dr. Cotton dazzled members at the conference with his stories about miraculous healing and impossibly high recovery rates. He even at one point during his speech blamed parents for spreading infection to their children by kissing them, drinking from the same glass, using the same utensils, and so on. And the medical providers seemed to eat that up. The crowd oohed and awed at his revelations, even calling him the new Dr. Lister. Only one person, Dr. D.K. Henderson, offered a dissenting view. Henderson argued that just because something may be true in one patient doesn't mean it can be applied to all cases. Finally, a spot of common sense. And he continued, who could forget the work of Kopoloff, Kirby, and Cheney, who had attempted to replicate Dr. Cotton's work without success? The rest of the crowd immediately poo-pooed Dr. Henderson's claims and returned to praising Dr. Cotton, calling him the hero of the hour. He ended the conference with an invitation from a Norwegian psychiatrist to come visit him in Norway before his final departure. Cotton and his family took him up on their offer, and they traveled to Norway before sailing back to New York in August. The fall of 1927 was an exciting time for Dr. Cotton, as it marked 20 years since he had become superintendent of the hospital. He celebrated the occasion with a grand celebration. More than 450 guests came to the dinner, including the governor of New Jersey himself. Undoubtedly, much of the dinner talk surrounded focal sepsis and surgeries, just like any good dinner conversation would. While Dr. Cotton was returning to his grandiose and celebrated state, Dr. Greenacre was quietly having her own difficulties. She had been tasked with returning to Trenton around the same time that she found out that her husband had been having an affair with his laboratory assistant. Her husband, Curtis Richter, was an academic and had resented that his wife pursued a career in medicine. He complained of her, quote, inability to create a home that would have attracted him, end quote. The worst part for Dr. Greenacre was that her husband's mistress was someone that she and her children both knew and liked. Heartbroken, she talked to Dr. Meyer about it before ultimately deciding to leave Trenton and abandon the project. She needed time to clear her mind and focus on her children. This decision relieved Cotton, as Dr. Greenacre's departure signaled the end of her investigation. Meanwhile, he had been able to maintain his job at the hospital and at a private hospital in Trenton, where he operated on wealthy folks who were willing to pay top dollar. And so things continued for Dr. Cotton until the summer of 1928, when he began having health complications again. He was diagnosed with a heart condition and angina, and by the end of August 1928, he had a number of vital teeth extracted with hopes of improving his condition. It was in July 1929 when Dr. Cotton operated on 2 people on the same day at his private practice and had an epiphany. His first patient was a 30-year-old woman who had been paranoid for 2 years and showed evidence of chronic infection. The patient had all of her teeth removed and went on to make a full recovery. The second patient was a 55-year-old who had been insane for 3 years. Only the molars and bicuspids were extracted, leaving about 16 teeth. This patient developed peritonitis and died within a week. What should have been a mere coincidence became God's truth for Dr. Cotton from that point on. He wasn't going to take any more chances with partial tooth removal. It was all the teeth or nothing. And so Dr. Cotton himself had his last 4 vital teeth extracted that same month, and this applied to all of his patients. He went on to insist that no major operation could be performed without the patient having all of their teeth removed first. It, in a way, as detestable as this was, there was sort of almost more of a buffer between the time of admission and major surgeries. If infection was detected in the teeth, then all of the teeth would be removed. And remember that no dentures were offered to patients at the state hospital. If symptoms persisted, the patient would undergo a series of serums and vaccines and colon irrigations to see if that helped. Some of the colon irrigations were said to go on for 6 to 8 hours a day. Most of these procedures today last about an hour, and that's plenty. If the patient didn't show signs of improvement after 4 to 5 months of these other treatments, then major operations would be considered. If symptoms still persisted after the surgery, Dr. Cotton simply reassured his patients that they were in, quote, perfect physical condition as far as the intestinal condition is concerned, end quote. Like, thanks. I'm glad my gut is okay, even if my brain is not. Oh, and also I don't have any teeth. By 1930, Dr. Cotton was making lots of money between his work at the state hospital and his private practice. Although he'd been doing it for years, it wasn't until early 1930 that a possible conflict of interest was raised by the hospital board. They encouraged Dr. Cotton to quit his private practice. But when he didn't, the board of directors made the decision to remove Dr. Cotton as medical director of the state hospital, effective October 1st, 1930, after 23 years as superintendent. Instead, he would become the medical director emeritus and director of research, so still having some sort of negotiating power. His longtime assistant, Dr. Robert Stone, would replace him as medical director. But Dr. Cotton, by now absolutely delusional about reality, excitedly told his mentor, Dr. Meyer, that he was retiring, had been thinking about it for a while, actually, and, well, now was as good of a time as any. Never mind that he was removed from the position. And now he could be freed from the administrative mumbo jumbo to focus on his true love, eliminating focal sepsis. Dr. Stone, however, wasted no time making changes that he believed were necessary. Although Dr. Stone had participated in many of the surgeries, he believed abdominal surgeries were too dangerous and not effective, so he began eliminating those procedures altogether. Dr. Cotton was furious. He began writing letters to Dr. Stone and to anyone who would read them, imploring them to bring back abdominal surgeries and the legacy he had worked so hard to create. After all, Dr. Cotton argued, his heart problems had entirely disappeared after he had his teeth removed. So didn't that say something about the effect of focal sepsis? Time went by, and surgeries decreased at the hospital, to the chagrin of Dr. Cotton. He continued writing and publishing articles about the evils of infection, as well as continuing thorough surgeries in his private practice for wealthy individuals. In June 1932, Emil Frankl, who served as the director of research of the New Jersey Department of Institutions and Agencies, began to comb through the hospital records and to compile a systematic account of the fate of the several hundred patients who had been subjected to abdominal surgery while at Trenton, comparing their fate to that of a sample of patients whom he listed as non-operative cases. In essence, this turned out to be an update of Dr. Greenacre's work that she hadn't been able to finish, along with more recent data than she would have been able to collect. Ultimately, Frankl agreed with Dr. Greenacre's conclusion that people who had thorough surgeries had lower recovery rates, and patients who did not have any operations were more likely to recover and discharge from the hospital. In fact, he made a graph of his findings that I'll post in the Facebook group. I think it speaks for itself. Here's what he found. Of the 309 patients who had total colectomies, 44.7% died afterward. 32.7% remained in the hospital unchanged. 7.8% had fully recovered and left the hospital. 7.4% showed improvement and left the hospital. 6.1% were unimproved but still left the hospital. So 77.4% of the patients who had this major surgery with or without consent either died or were unchanged. Those are not good odds. Next, Frankel found that people who had the paracolic membranotomies, that less invasive intestinal procedure, found that the majority, 55.4% of them, remained in the hospital. 13.7% died. 12.3% were recovered and left the hospital. 13.4% showed improvement and left the hospital. 5% were unimproved but still left the hospital. So even with that less invasive procedure, 69% either died or remained in the hospital. And finally, Frankel found that among patients who did not undergo surgery, 18% died, 30.2% remained in the hospital, 26.5% were recovered and left the hospital, 16.7% showed improvement and left the hospital, 8.6% were unimproved but still left the hospital. So almost 52% of patients without surgery were able to be discharged from the hospital. Those are significant findings. Of course, Dr. Cotton had something to say about it, probably something like, but look, fewer people died during the surgeries over the years. And that was true. Frankel found about a 2% decrease in mortality rates from 1918 to 1932. Not an impressive finding, but a decrease nonetheless. But that didn't stop Dr. Cotton from writing more articles aimed at lay people regarding his findings. He was still as determined as ever to make a name for himself, just like his notable colleagues. By early spring 1933, Dr. Cotton still had a number of supporters. His articles were accepted for publication, and once again, the public would be able to read about his life's work. Before they could be published, however, on May 8, 1933, Dr. Henry Cotton died suddenly of a heart attack at his Trenton club shortly after lunch. It made headline news that evening. World-famous alienist drops dead. And people came out of the woodwork to lament the loss of a great healer and to continue some of his delusions. Quote, there were few men in the public life of the state who could point to a record so replete with notable achievements. And at his hands, the recovery rate among the state's mentally ill had risen as high as 87%. And thousands of people who have suffered mental affliction owe Dr. Cotton an enduring debt of gratitude for displacing confusion and despair with hope and confidence, end quote. For what it was worth, Dr. Cotton's mentor, Dr. Meyer, appreciated the complexity of Cotton's legacy. Meyer called him a man of action and of results, whose legacy was shrouded in controversy. Of his former mentee, he stated, quote, the history of the developments at the Trenton State Hospital is a most remarkable achievement of the pioneer spirit, and the history of Dr. Cotton, one of remarkable example of energy, purpose, and wholeheartedness, end quote. Andrew Scull, however, ends his book with these haunting words, quote, with not a sideways glance at what Meyer knew to be in reality, a history of more than a decade of forced treatments, mass maiming, and deaths in the service of a therapeutically bankrupt ideal, end quote. It's hard to parse out how much Dr. Cotton genuinely wanted to help patients because he certainly seemed to believe in the efficacy of his treatments and how much he wanted to make a name for himself in the annals of psychiatry. But good providers remain humble and open-minded, letting the science speak for itself rather than forcing results to fit a certain narrative. Good providers accept feedback and remain flexible, willing to change with new advancements and changes in culture and society. Good providers remain patient-focused rather than achievement-focused. And the tragedy of the New Jersey State Hospital at Trenton is that one doctor lost that focus, and many, many people's lives were damaged as a result. The hospital is now called Trenton Psychiatric Hospital. It's since gone on to adopt new, humane practices, but the legacy of Dr. Cotton lived on far too long. Teeth were extracted there up until the 1960s, when the hospital finally put an end to it. I cringe to think of what Dorothea Dix would have thought of her hospital by the time Dr. Cotton's removal as medical director. She had wanted to bring back dignity to the treatment of the mentally ill, but Dr. Cotton seemed to eliminate it entirely. And that's where I'll end the history of the Trenton Psychiatric Hospital, but there's certainly more to share. Next week, I'm going to bring some stories to life, namely the amazing story of Dr. Phyllis Greenacre. I am so excited to tell her story and introduce you to this powerhouse of a woman. So stay tuned for that. And as always, thank you so much for listening. I am so pleased that people around the world are tuning into my little podcast. And remember, do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. Until next time. Thank you so much for listening to Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. Once again, I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup. Cover image is by Christopher Payne. Check out my website at behindthewallspodcast.buzzsprout.com. Follow the podcast and learn more on Facebook at Behind the Walls Podcast and Instagram at Behind the Walls Pod. For questions or recommendations, email me at behindthewallspodcast@gmail.com. You can find new episodes every Monday on Amazon Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you're listening right now. If you like the show, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. It helps other people find and listen to the show, and I would be so grateful. Please stay tuned for more episodes of Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. Until next time.